The growing number of actual participants, would-be participants, and observers made me wonder about the environment in which they grew up. I wanted to know more about how this privileged American community raised its children, especially its sons. I was also curious about the silence of the other kids, the Glen Ridge adolescents who had not been in the basement and would never have thought of going down there. The newspapers were saying that accounts of what had happened had circulated among the students in the high school for almost 3 months before the arrests, but that the kids had kept it to themselves. They hadn't gone to the police, and they hadn't told their parents or teachers. Why was it so important to protect a bunch of classmates who enjoyed sticking a bat and a broom into a retarded woman? Weren't they worried about what had been done to her, and what might happen to her in the future if the truth were suppressed? Maybe the silence of Glen Ridge students was a symptom of grief and shame, colored by self-interest. Maybe they were thinking, keep quiet for a couple of months, and this will all blow over, and we'll graduate and slip off to college. It was more difficult to understand the comments attributed to adolescents after the arrests. Some teenagers told reporters she teased them into it. She asked for it. She was promiscuous. Adults in the community were slightly more guarded in their comments. She was always flirting. This is Leslie just getting into more trouble. People in Glen Ridge were saying the girl is to blame for all that happened to her. And it wasn't only a few people. The stories suggested that such views were widespread in the town. Without doubt, a grave moral transgression had taken place in the community on March 1st. Didn't the adults there see it the same way? Weren't parents worried about how their sons were growing up? Weren't they concerned about what might happen to their daughters? What kind of place was Glen Ridge anyway? A large group of charismatic athletes, a retarded young woman, the silence of the students and adults, the inclination to blame the woman and exonerate the men. These elements seem to be linked by a familiar theme in my life in journalism. I began to frame Glen Ridge as a story of power and powerlessness, the power of young males and the community that venerated them, and the powerlessness of one marginalized young woman, one woman whom I knew about from the media coverage. Maybe there were other young women with stories to tell. The sense of social nihilism expressed by many youngsters in Newark was attributable, at least partially, to their economic condition and the social devastation it created. The immutable condition they all shared was poverty. Being poor was the ongoing trauma of their childhoods. You could draw a line from the rubble of the streets to the rubble of their lives. Of course, Glen Ridge was different. It was a town where almost everybody was pretty well off. If I decided to write about this place, I would have to readjust my perspective. The prosperity of Glen Ridge didn't negate the impact of economics on the values of young people in the suburb. But instead of writing about the sense of impotency arising from generations of poverty, I might be writing about how affluence and privilege could inflate the self-importance of otherwise unremarkable young men, not always with good results. This was all surmise from a distance. Before I decided to write about Glen Ridge, I wanted to take a closer look at the boys involved in the alleged rape, at the residents, and at the town. In the late afternoon of June 23, 1989, I boarded a number 33 DeCamp Line bus from the Port Authority bus terminal in New York City. 40 minutes later, I got off at the intersection of Bloomfield and Ridgewood Avenues in Glen Ridge. I followed the crowd that was walking toward the field behind the high school where the graduation ceremonies for the class of '89 were about to begin. My first mental snapshot. Glen Ridge was a squeaky clean, manicured town that liked to display its affluence by dressing its high school.